I first met my wife in the basement of the Poetry Cafe 15 years ago. She was a super hot East Asian woman with a working class East London accent, which basically ticked the only two boxes I had. She went up and read some absolutely filthy poems that had all the middle-aged men lined up to chat to her afterwards. A couple of weeks later we bumped into each other again and headed off to the nearby boozer. We chatted about Hagakure, the silly book of samurai proverbs that I was reading at the time. The proverbs that were featured in the movie Ghost Dog and were written by a samurai that had never been in a single sword fight in his life. The conversation soon shifted to the subject of 80s action movies before it took a more serious turn. It was then that we cast aside our early dating jitters and found that we converged on the acceptance of a truth that locked our lives together. We both confessed that Roger Moore was our favourite James Bond. The first film I wore out on videotape was The Man with the Golden Gun. This was a time when the VCR, as the Yanks called it, or the video, as we called it, was still magic. This is when people would place their videotapes inside faux leather cases and stack them up on their living room shelves alongside unread copies of Jane Eyre and Moby Dick. Finally, there was deliverance from regulating your life against what was on the telly. That said, most people would stay in to tape a film rather than set the timer. This involved sitting next to the video with your finger over the pause button waiting for the exact right moment, and then being ready to press it again whenever the commercial break intruded. You never enjoyed the initial viewing because of this. You did it so that your future self would enjoy each subsequent viewing. Also, no one would ever tape the end credits, so a few bars into the Star Wars theme, a sudden static white fuzz would wash across the screen before dispersing to reveal whatever was on the tape beforehand. If you were really lucky and your parents hadn't kept track, the static fuzz would shift to reveal two people going at it. Now there was that song by the fun-loving criminals called Barry White Saved My Life, but it was Roger Moore that saved mine, because I wouldn't have, for want of a better word, bonded with my wife if it wasn't for him. And I know that all married people say something like this, but I really owe so many good things in my life to being with her. When I first started teaching, she was the one that found all the module textbooks online and bought them for me. When something opened up in my career that I didn't think I was up to the task for, she was the one that convinced me otherwise. For me, she's more than the Bond girl that survives to the end of the film. She's more than the perpetually doe-eyed Miss Moneypenny. Mrs. O'Sullivan is M. This sentiment was echoed by Sir Roger himself when he said, "The secret to a long happy marriage is to always have the last word, as long as that last word is always, yes dear." This wasn't the only way in which I imitated Sir Roger's behaviour. For instance, whenever I was solicited in the seedier parts of central London, I would often adopt Sir Roger's mannerisms in how I responded. So when a woman approached me and asked, "Would you like to meet some girls?" I immediately replied, "Well, that sounds delightful, but I don't think the girl back home would be too happy." A few years ago, for my birthday, we went to see the man himself for one of those audience with shows where he told all the usual self-deprecating yarns. We were able to get a copy of his book with an autograph plate, basically a signed sticker that had been tacked in by someone else. It was fine, but I wanted something more, so one afternoon, after a day's teaching, I lined up with a few hundred others at King's Cross Station. A generation of men. It really was all men that ranged from those who first watched The Saint when it was on TV to those who saw Octopussy when it was released in the cinema. The man in front of me had been to a few of his signings before. He said there was normally time for a chinwag with Sir Roger, but they seemed to be rushing everyone through nowadays. I realised that a lot of the men in this line, it wasn't their first rodeo. I resolved that once was going to be enough for me. I got to the front and offered my hand. Roger was dressed in a blazer and slacks. His dyed comb-over, tinted glasses and Monaco tan offered that touch of class. His wife was sat next to him with a wide, unwavering smile, perhaps compensating for the one he wasn't quite able to sustain. He shook my hand and scribbled in my book. I told him that one reason why me and my wife hooked up was because we were such big fans of his. He handed my book back and said, "Well, I wish you all the best with your marriage." I wasn't sure how to feel about being wished such a thing by a man with 3 divorces to his name. There was certainly a weariness to him. He was well into his late 80s by now. He looked every year that he had lived and every dollar he was worth. I wonder how we looked to him, a line of balding, paunchy, gammony fanboys that would never make it past the portfolio stage of a James Bond casting. I knew that it wouldn't be long before Sir Roger stepped from the throwaway quirk of the showbiz pages to the lofty prose of the obituary column. I always assumed that, come the time, I would shed a tear like I would for a favourite mad uncle. The thing was that the news of Sir Roger's death came a few hours after the news that a young man had wheeled a suitcase into the foyer of the Manchester Arena just as thousands of children and their parents were shuffling out of the Ariana Grande gig. The strange thing was that the news of Sir Roger's death, which must have been devastating for those that loved him and knew him well, in the context of this atrocity, it offered a moment of levity. He had lived a good, full life in which he'd worked as a UNICEF ambassador helping thousands of children. I try not to take any joy in the deaths of bad people. Life is not a James Bond film after all, but the death of my hero reminded me that a long life, well lived, is a good thing in this age of boundless cruelty. For the first time that day, I smiled.